Sabata wasn't just another spaghetti western. It was a circus act with guns, a film where the star refused to smile, where weapons hid in guitars, and where an entire town was built just to blow it apart. The script was rewritten on horseback. The stunts defied gravity and logic. And one actor, he showed up thinking he was in a different movie entirely. These are 20 weird facts about Sabata. And the bonus, let's just say the director had to choose between his two leads, and he picked the wrong one. Load your weapon. This shootout's about to get strange. Number 1. Lee Van Cleef wasn't the first choice for Sabata. The role was originally offered to Clint Eastwood, riding high after the good, the bad, and the ugly. The producers wanted that same stone-faced intensity, that squint, that silence. They sent him the script, made their pitch, offered serious money, but Eastwood said no. Not because he didn't like it, because he was done being tied to Italy. He wanted to move on, try new things, break free from the spaghetti western typecast that was starting to follow him everywhere. The producers panicked for about a day, then realized they already had their answer. Lee Van Cleef had just wrapped For a Few Dollars More, and the good, the bad, and the ugly playing the villain both times. Cold, calculating, unforgettable. This time, they wanted him as the hero. Van Cleef said yes immediately. He loved the character's mystery, the gadgets, the acrobatic style. And from the first frame, he owned it. Sabata wasn't Eastwood's silent drifter. He was something sharper, stranger, almost supernatural. Van Cleef didn't just replace Eastwood. He redefined what a spaghetti western hero could be, one spring-loaded weapon at a time. Number 2. The script for Sabata was barely finished when filming began. Director Gianfranco Parolini had a vision, action, mystery, style over logic, but the actual story kept shifting day by day. Scenes were added on location. Dialogue was scribbled on napkins during lunch breaks. Some actors showed up to set without knowing what their characters were supposed to do that day. The cinematographer later admitted he framed shots based on instinct because half the time, he didn't know what was happening either. But Parolini loved it. He saw filmmaking as improvisation, a high-wire act where planning too much killed the energy. Lee Van Cleef hated it. He wanted structure, rehearsal time, clear motivations. He'd ask, "Why does Sabata do this?" And Parolini would shrug and say, "Because it looks cool." They clashed constantly, not loudly, but intense, quiet exchanges between takes. Van Cleef would rewrite his own lines, tighten them, make them sharper. Parolini would let him, then change the camera angle to force a different delivery. It became a silent war of wills, but somehow that tension bled into the character. Sabata felt unpredictable because the film itself was unpredictable. You can see it in Van Cleef's eyes, a man trying to stay one step ahead in a world that refuses to follow the rules. And maybe that's exactly what made it work. Number 3. Sabata's weapons weren't just props, they were inventions. The character carried a custom rifle with a hidden derringer in the stock, spring-loaded knives, a 4-barreled shotgun disguised as a walking stick. None of it was standard issue. The Italian prop master, Carlo Simi, built each piece by hand, working late into the night, sketching designs, testing mechanics, creating firearms that didn't exist anywhere else. Some worked perfectly, others misfired, jammed, or fell apart mid-scene. During one take, Van Cleef pulled the trigger on the hidden derringer, and nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. The prop master rushed over, dismantled it on the spot, and realized a spring had snapped. They didn't have a replacement, so they improvised. They filmed the scene without the gun firing, then added the sound effect in post-production. It looked seamless on screen, but behind the scenes, it was chaos held together with wire and hope. And that 4-barreled shotgun, the one Sabata spins like a baton before unloading into his enemies, it was so heavy, Van Cleef could barely lift it. He trained for weeks just to make the motion look effortless. On screen, it's smooth, deadly, iconic. Off-screen, his arms were screaming.
A rifle that never misses.
Number 4. The town of Daugherty, Texas, where most of Sabata takes place, doesn't exist. It never did. The entire set was built from scratch in the Spanish desert outside Almeria, the same location used for dozens of spaghetti westerns, including the good, the bad, and the ugly. But unlike other films that reused existing sets, Sabata demanded something new. Parolini wanted a town that felt prosperous but corrupt, clean streets hiding dirty secrets. So, the production designer constructed an entire main street, complete with a saloon, a bank, storefronts, even a church with a working bell tower. It took 6 weeks to build and cost a significant chunk of this film's budget. The crew lived on site, sleeping in tents behind the fake buildings. At night, the set looked like a ghost town because it was one, and when filming wrapped, they didn't preserve it. They blew half of it up for the final shootout, dismantled the rest, and left the desert to reclaim what remained. Today, there's almost nothing left. Just sand, scattered wood, and the memory of a town that never was but looked more real than most. Number 5. William Berger, who played the bandit Banjo, showed up to set thinking he was in a serious Western drama. He'd read an early version of the script, one that was darker, grittier, more focused on betrayal and revenge. He prepared for weeks, studied his character's motivations, even grew out his hair and beard to look weathered and dangerous. Then he arrived on location and watched a stuntman do a backflip off a roof while firing 2 pistols mid-air. That's when it hit him. This wasn't a drama, it was a circus. Berger was furious. He confronted Parolini, demanded to know why the script had changed so drastically. Parolini just laughed and told him, "The audience doesn't want Shakespeare, they want spectacle." Berger almost walked off, but his agent convinced him to stay, and once he let go of his expectations, something shifted. He leaned into the absurdity, played Banjo like a con artist who knew he was in over his head, half charming, half desperate. His performance became one of the film's highlights, a man caught between wanting to be a hero and knowing he's just another fool with a gun. And the irony, Berger later admitted, Sabata was one of his favorite roles because it taught him to stop taking everything so seriously. Number 6. The film's score wasn't composed in a studio. Marcello Giombini, the composer, wrote most of the music while watching rough cuts on a tiny projector in his Roman apartment. He didn't have access to an orchestra yet, so he recorded temp tracks using a single guitar, a harmonica, and his own voice humming melodies. Those rough demos were supposed to be placeholders, but Parolini loved them. He thought they sounded raw, immediate, strange. So, when Giombini finally had a full orchestra at his disposal, Parolini told him to keep that unpolished energy. The result was a score that blended traditional Western motifs with experimental sounds, whistling, discordant strings, rhythms that felt off-kilter and unsettling. Some critics hated it. They called it amateurish, too weird for a Western. But audiences were mesmerized. The music didn't just accompany the action. It amplified the strangeness of Sabata's world, where nothing followed the rules, not even the soundtrack. Decades later, Quentin Tarantino cited Giombini's score as an influence, proof that what sounded wrong in 1969 eventually sounded visionary. And those rough demos Giombini recorded alone in his apartment, they're still floating around in private collections, raw and haunting. A glimpse of what the film almost sounded like. Number 7. Lee Van Cleef refused to smile in Sabata, not because he couldn't, because he believed the character shouldn't. He saw Sabata as a man who'd seen too much, a gunfighter who moved through the world like a ghost, untouchable, unreadable. Parolini wanted moments of levity, a smirk here, a grin there, something to make the character more likable. Van Cleef said no every single time. He argued that the moment Sabata smiled, he became human, relatable, and that would ruin the mystique. Parolini pushed back. They debated between takes, during lunch, even after wrap. The crew started placing bets on who would win. In the end, Van Cleef won. There's not a single genuine smile in the entire film. Sabata stays cold, calculating, a man who kills without emotion and walks away without looking back. And somehow, that absence of warmth made him more compelling. Audiences weren't watching a hero, they were watching a force of nature, something beyond good or evil, just lethal and unstoppable. Van Cleef's refusal to break character, even for a second, turned Sabata into an icon. Not because he was likable, but because he was unknowable. And in a genre filled with charming rogues and righteous gunslingers, that made him unforgettable. Number 8. The opening shootout in the saloon wasn't planned. At least, not the way it happened. The script called for a tense standoff, some dialogue, then a quick draw. But on the day of shooting, one of the stuntmen suggested something different. What if Sabata didn't wait for the draw? What if he moved first? Fast, brutal, no warning. Parolini loved it, blocking, and let the stunt team choreograph a new sequence on the spot. They spent 2 hours rehearsing. using real furniture, real glass, real chaos. When they finally rolled cameras, it was one take. Van Cleef kicked a table, dove behind the bar, fired 3 shots without looking, and walked out as bodies collapsed behind him. The whole thing lasted less than 30 seconds on screen, but it set the tone for the entire film. Sabata wasn't a fair fighter. He was a survivor. And in a world where everyone's trying to kill you, fairness is just another word for dead. That spontaneous rewrite became one of the most referenced scenes in spaghetti western history, proof that sometimes the best moments happen when you throw out the plan and trust the chaos. Number 9. Franco Ressel, who played the villainous Stengel, was terrified of horses. Not just nervous, genuinely phobic. As a child, he'd been thrown from a horse and trampled, leaving him with a broken rib and a fear that never went away. When he accepted the role, he didn't realize how much riding would be required. The script had Stengel on horseback constantly, riding through town, chasing Sabata, leading his men into battle. Ressel tried to hide his fear, but the moment he climbed into the saddle, his hands shook. The horse sensed it immediately and started acting up, bucking, sidestepping, refusing to move. Parolini noticed and quietly pulled Ressel aside. They made a deal. Every wide shot, every galloping scene, a stunt double would take over. But for close-ups, Ressel had to do it himself. So the crew trained him, slowly, patiently. They used the calmest horse on set, walked him through the motions, never pushed too hard. And Ressel, to his credit, fought through the fear. In the film, Stengel rides with confidence, authority, power. But if you look closely at the close-ups, you can see the tension in Ressel's jaw, the white-knuckle grip on the reins. He wasn't acting tough. He was conquering terror one scene at a time. And somehow, that real fear made Stengel feel more dangerous, a man holding on to control by sheer force of will. Number 10. Sabata's iconic acrobatic sidekick, played by Nick Jordan, real name Gianni Rizzo, was supposed to die halfway through the film. The original script had his character sacrificing himself to save Sabata, a heroic death that would have given the film emotional weight. But during a test screening of early footage, audiences went wild for the acrobat. They loved his flips, his cocky grin, the way he moved like a human weapon. Parolini watched the crowd's reaction and made a snap decision. He rewrote the second half of the script on the spot, keeping the character alive, giving him more scenes, more stunts, more screen time. The problem was they'd already filmed some of the death scene. Jordan had been shot, had collapsed dramatically, had delivered his final words. So they had to reshoot, pretending the injury wasn't fatal, adding a quick line about how he'd only been grazed. It's clumsy if you're looking for it, but most audiences never noticed because by that point, they were too caught up in the spectacle. And Jordan, he didn't complain. He just kept flipping. Number 11. The bank vault explosion was real, and it nearly killed the entire crew. In the script, Sabata's gang blows open a massive vault door to steal Confederate gold. Parolini wanted it to look spectacular, so he hired a demolitions expert who'd worked on war films. They rigged the vault with enough explosives to launch the door 20 feet, built blast shields, marked safe zones, calculated the trajectory. Everything looked perfect on paper, but when they detonated the charge, something went catastrophically wrong. The vault door didn't fly straight. It spun sideways, tumbling through the air like a metal coin, and slammed into a support beam 6 feet from where the camera crew was standing. The impact was so violent it bent the beam, sent splinters flying, and left a dent you could fit your fist inside. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then someone yelled to check for injuries. Miraculously, no one was hurt, but it was close. Too close. Parolini immediately shut down production for the day, brought in a new explosives team, and recalculated every blast for the rest of the shoot. They kept the shot because the chaos looked incredible on film, but behind the scenes, it became a cautionary tale. One crew member later said, "We weren't making a movie. We were surviving one." And when you watch that vault door spin through the frame, knowing how close it came to ending everything, the explosion feels less like a stunt and more like a near-death experience caught on camera. Number 12. Sabata's costume was cursed, or at least Lee Van Cleef thought so. The black outfit, custom tailored in Rome, looked perfect. Tight jacket, crisp pants, polished boots. But from day one, things kept going wrong. The jacket's seam split during the first action scene, forcing a wardrobe repair mid-shoot. The boots gave Van Cleef blisters so severe he could barely walk between takes. Then, during a horseback chase, his hat flew off and landed directly in a pile of horse manure. The crew laughed. Van Cleef didn't. He became convinced the costume was jinxed, that something about it was working against him. He started performing small rituals before wearing it, tapping the jacket 3 times, checking every button twice, refusing to put it on until the cameras were about to roll. The wardrobe department thought he was being superstitious and ridiculous. But then, during a crucial gunfight scene, Van Cleef's holster strap snapped at the worst possible moment, sending his pistol clattering to the ground mid-draw. Parolini yelled "cut," furious, thinking Van Cleef had fumbled the choreography. But when they examined the holster, the leather had simply disintegrated, worn through despite being brand new. After that, even the skeptics started to wonder. They replaced every piece of the costume, stitched reinforcements into every seam, double-checked every clasp. And for the rest of the shoot, nothing else went wrong. Coincidence? Maybe. Van Cleef never stopped tapping in that jacket 3 times. Number 13. The film's most iconic stunt, where the acrobat leaps from a second-story balcony, bounces off a wagon canopy, and somersaults into a perfect landing, was never supposed to happen. The original stunt called for a simple jump, a roll, nothing fancy. But Nick Jordan, the actor performing it, was a former circus performer who had spent years perfecting aerial acrobatics. He told Parolini he could do something better, something nobody had ever seen in a Western. Parolini was skeptical but intrigued. So, Jordan demonstrated, launching himself off a practice platform, executing a mid-air twist that defied physics, and sticking the landing without even stumbling. The crew erupted in applause. Parolini immediately rewrote the scene to feature the stunt prominently. But there was a problem: insurance. The production's insurance company refused to cover such a dangerous maneuver, calling it reckless and unnecessary. Jordan offered to sign a waiver, taking full responsibility if anything went wrong. The insurance company still said no, so Jordan did it anyway. He performed the stunt without coverage, without safety nets, without a second take planned, because he knew he'd only get one shot at it. When the cameras rolled, he nailed it perfectly, soaring through the air like he'd been launched from a cannon. The footage was so spectacular that Parolini used it in the film's trailer, turning an unauthorized stunt into the movie's signature moment. And Jordan, he never got hurt, never regretted it, never stopped reminding people that sometimes the best ideas are the ones everyone tells you not to try. Number 14. The Gatling gun scene, where Sabata mows down an entire gang with a hand-cranked machine gun, almost didn't make the final cut, not because of the violence, because the gun didn't work. The prop department had acquired a replica Gatling gun from a military museum, a beautiful piece that looked period-accurate and menacing. But when they tested it on set, the mechanism jammed constantly. The barrels wouldn't rotate smoothly, the ammunition belt kept tangling, and the crank handle fell off twice. The prop master spent 3 days trying to fix it, lubricating gears, adjusting springs, rebuilding the feed system. Nothing worked. Parolini was ready to scrap the entire sequence, rewrite it with conventional rifles. But then someone suggested a radical solution. Don't fix the gun, fake it. They rigged the Gatling gun to rotate manually using an off-camera motor, fired blanks from hidden rifles synchronized to match the barrel rotation, and added muzzle flashes in post-production. It was a massive cheat, a total illusion, but on screen it looked devastating, brutal, unstoppable. Van Cleef cranked that handle with such intensity, such cold determination, that audiences never questioned whether the gun was actually firing. They just watched in awe as Sabata unleashed mechanical hell. The scene became one of the film's most memorable moments, and the irony is that the gun everyone remembers so vividly never fired a single bullet. Number 15. Halfway through production, Lee Van Cleef and Gianfranco Parolini stopped speaking to each other. Their creative differences had been simmering for weeks. Small disagreements about pacing, tone, character motivation. But the breaking point came during a heated argument about Sabata's final confrontation. Van Cleef wanted a slow, methodical showdown, something psychological and tense. Parolini wanted explosions, acrobatics, spectacle. They shouted at each other in front of the entire crew, neither willing to back down. Finally, Van Cleef walked off set, locked himself in his trailer, and refused to come out. Production halted for 6 hours. The producers panicked, afraid they'd lose their lead actor and sink the entire film. But William Berger, who'd been watching the conflict escalate, stepped in as mediator. He shuttled between Van Cleef's trailer and Parolini's director's chair, carrying messages, proposing compromises, slowly building a bridge between two stubborn men. Eventually, they reached an agreement, shoot it both ways, Van Cleef's version and Parolini's version, then decide in editing which worked better. They filmed both sequences over 2 exhausting days. And in the final cut, Parolini used elements from both, combining Van Cleef's quiet intensity with his own explosive vision. It shouldn't have worked, but somehow it did. The final showdown feels unpredictable, shifting between stillness and chaos, keeping audiences off balance until the very end. And Van Cleef and Parolini never spoke about their fight again, just moved forward, making the movie, proving that sometimes great art comes from conflict, not collaboration. Number 16. The film's most quotable line, "I'm Sabata and death is my business," was never in the original script. It was improvised by Lee Van Cleef during a take where he'd forgotten his actual dialogue. The scene called for Sabata to introduce himself to a corrupt banker, establishing his reputation through a carefully written speech. But Van Cleef blanked, stood there in awkward silence, then blurted out the first thing that came to mind. The line was so perfectly in character, so effortlessly cool, that Parolini kept it. He didn't even yell cut, just let the scene continue, watching Van Cleef recover and finish the sequence flawlessly. When they watched playback, everyone agreed the improvised line was better than anything the screenwriter had written. It became the character's defining statement, repeated in sequels, quoted in reviews, referenced in dozens of westerns that followed. And the strangest part is that Van Cleef couldn't remember where it came from, whether he had heard it somewhere, dreamed it, or pulled it from thin air in a moment of panic. He just knew it sounded right, felt true to who Sabata was. Sometimes the best writing doesn't come from a typewriter. It comes from an actor standing in front of a camera, forgetting everything, and finding something real in the emptiness. Number 17. The Confederate gold at the center of the plot wasn't gold at all. It was painted wood. The production couldn't afford enough prop gold to fill the bank vault convincingly, so the art department built wooden bricks, spray-painted them metallic yellow, and stacked them carefully to hide the fact that they were hollow. The plan worked perfectly until a stuntman crashed into the vault during a fight scene and sent the gold bricks flying. They bounced, they cracked, one even split open, revealing raw wood inside. The crew froze, certain the take was ruined. But Parolini kept the cameras rolling, and in the chaos, nobody watching would ever notice that the gold bars were defying physics. Too light, too bouncy. In post-production, they carefully edited around the broken bricks, darkened the vault interior to hide the damage, and added sound effects of heavy metal, clanging to sell the illusion. It worked flawlessly. Critics praised the film's authentic-looking treasure. Audiences never questioned it. Only years later, when the production designer gave an interview, did the truth come out. And even then, people didn't care, because in a film where reality was always negotiable, fake gold felt perfectly appropriate. In Sabata's world, everything was a con, even the treasure. Number 18. The sequel, Adios, Sabata, confused everyone because Lee Van Cleef wasn't in it. The studio wanted to capitalize on Sabata's success quickly, so they rushed a second film into production. But Van Cleef had already committed to another project and wasn't available. Rather than delay the sequel, the producers made a bizarre decision. They'd shoot it with a different lead actor, Yul Brynner, and still call the character Sabata. When the film was released in Italy, audiences were baffled. This Sabata looked different, acted different, moved differently. Some thought it was a prequel. Others assumed it was a mistake. The confusion grew worse when a third film, Return of Sabata, brought Van Cleef back, making the Brynner version feel like a fever dream that never really happened. Critics accused the studio of lazy cash grab filmmaking, of treating the character like a brand rather than a person. And they were right, but the studio didn't care because all 3 films made money. The strange part is that Adios, Sabata was originally written as a completely different film with a different character. But when the studio realized they could slap the Sabata name on it and boost ticket sales, they simply changed the protagonist's name and called it a sequel. No rewrites, no adjustments, just a global find and replace. And somehow, audiences accepted it. proving that in the wild world of spaghetti westerns, continuity was optional and nobody really cared as long as someone was shooting somebody. Number 19. The film's final shootout, where Sabata takes on an entire army single-handedly, was inspired by a real historical event, sort of. Parolini had read about a legendary gunfighter who'd held off a group of outlaws from a church bell tower, using the height advantage to pick them off one by one. He loved the idea and wanted to recreate it, but bigger, louder, more impossible. So, Sabata's final stand became a masterclass in strategic violence, using mirrors to redirect sunlight and blind his enemies, rigging explosives to collapse buildings, turning the entire town into a death trap. It was elaborate, ridiculous, and completely impractical. Military consultants who visited the set pointed out that half the tactics wouldn't work in real life, that Sabata would have been killed in the first 30 seconds. Parolini didn't care, because Sabata wasn't a real gunfighter, he was a myth. And myths don't follow the rules of physics or probability, they follow the rules of legend. So, Sabata survives impossible odds, walks away without a scratch, and leaves behind a town littered with bodies and questions. The scene became a template for action films that followed, proving that audiences don't want realism in their heroes, they want immortality. And in that final shootout, Sabata didn't just win a battle, he became untouchable, a ghost story that would haunt the West forever. Number 20. When Sabata finally wrapped, the cast and crew celebrated with a party that lasted 3 days. They had survived explosions, injuries, creative battles, and a production that constantly teetered on the edge of disaster. Tents were set up on the demolished remains of the Doherty set. Someone brought guitars, someone else brought wine, and the Spanish desert filled with music, laughter, and relief. Lee Van Cleef, who'd been so serious throughout the shoot, finally relaxed. He sang badly, told stories from his war days, and even smiled, the one thing he'd refused to do on camera. William Berger challenged the stunt team to an acrobatics competition and promptly pulled a muscle trying to match their flips. Parolini gave a speech thanking everyone, admitting the film had been harder than he'd expected, stranger than he'd planned, and better than he'd hoped. On the third night, as the party wound down, someone asked Van Cleef if he'd do another Sabata film. He laughed and said, "Ask me when I can feel my feet again." But he did come back, twice, because despite the chaos, despite the fights, despite everything, Sabata had gotten under his skin. It wasn't just a role anymore, it was a part of him, and walking away felt impossible. Bonus fact: that iconic harmonica that Sabata's character plays wasn't just a prop. Lee Van Cleef actually learned to play it for the film, spending weeks practicing scales, melodies, and the haunting theme that became synonymous with the character. But here's the twist. In the final film, almost none of Van Cleef's actual playing made it into the soundtrack. The music was recorded by a professional session musician whose tone was cleaner, more precise. Van Cleef was devastated when he found out, feeling like his hard work had been erased. But Parolini assured him it wasn't wasted because what mattered wasn't the sound, it was the authenticity. When Sabata lifts that harmonica to his lips, audiences see a man who knows how to play, whose fingers move with real skill, whose breath creates real music. That authenticity sold the moment, even if the audio was replaced. And years later, Van Cleef still carried a harmonica in his pocket, playing it between takes on other films, a small piece of Sabata that never left him.